Thank you for joining us today for this month's University of Wisconsin Division of Extension Badger Dairy Insight, a monthly webinar series offered on the third Tuesday of each month. Doesn't seem like it's already the third Tuesday, but Badger Dairy Insight provides the latest research, dairy-based information to improve animal welfare, breeding and genetics, automation and modernization, and nutritional decisions for producers, dairy workers and managers, and agricultural professionals. My name is Matt Lippert. I'm the Regional Dairy Educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension in Clark, Wood, and Marathon counties. We hope to provide this opportunity as an informal discussion on today's topic. As this is a webinar format, please add any questions or comments in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted at dairy.extension.wisc.edu. Our topic today is grazing and virtual fencing on dairy farms. Much research is being done around how grazing can fit into the modern dairy setup. Also, we will hear about virtual fencing and how it works. Our first speaker today is David Jaramillo. He's an animal scientist at the UW Dairy Forage Research Center. Dr. Jaramillo is located in Marshfield, Wisconsin, where much of the research based out of the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station. Dr. Jaramillo's research program is focused on developing grazing systems that fit into the modern dairy, encompassing aspects of animal nutrition, as well as pasture and forage management. Over the long term, Dr. Jaramillo's research goals are to identify critical grazing management strategies needed to improve pasture productivity and dairy heifer growth in order to increase the adoption of pasture-based systems for rearing dairy heifers. So with that introduction, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all to share a little bit of the research that we've been doing since I came on board here in Wisconsin. And to start things off, I wanted to just mention that today's dairy farm resembles very little to what the typical farm looked back about 100 or even earlier than that. And not only do our farms look much different, but our animals have also changed. This is on the left, we see what a typical Holstein looked like back in the early turn of the century. And on the right, we have what the Holstein Association depicts as the ideal Holstein animal. And on top of that, the way in which we work our animals has also shifted, where we've gone from more manual labor to more mechanized and precision systems such as this rotary milking system. And we've even transitioned to more and more adoption of robotic systems where we can even increase our precision feeding systems for dairy cows. But perhaps with all these things combined, one of the largest changes that we've seen is when we look at what the typical dairy farm looked like in the 1940s, pasture and hay were actually the main components of dairy cattle diets, whereas nowadays, corn, silage, and alfalfa make up the vast majority of the diet in these animals. So with all these things combined, what has this really meant? So our dairy cow population has actually decreased since the 80s, but the production per given dairy cow has actually increased. But so what? So this has meant that our carbon footprint or our environmental footprint has actually decreased significantly in the past 80 years. And our carbon footprint is actually 63% less than it was close to 80 years ago. So this means that we're producing more milk today than with using less feed, using less land, less water, which is critical in is becoming more and more critical in certain regions, but also using less fuel. But when we compare ourselves in terms of the carbon footprint of milk production Um, we see that New Zealand, it tends to have the least, or is often cited as having the least carbon footprint of milk production, and the US is just slightly below. So I'd make the argument that within the industry as a whole, we're headed in the right direction, but there's still plenty of room for improvement to continue to work towards meeting our net zero goals and our climate targets. So what are some strategies that we can adopt to keep making strides towards meeting our goals and becoming more carbon negative or carbon neutral? So I'll make the strong case for, or at least try to make the case for pasture systems. So pasture systems as a whole, they may be especially attractive for the dairy farm because they are oftentimes the least cost method of forage production. So they can be a cheap feed to produce, especially when we consider perennial pastures. And this is largely because perennial pastures can be highly productive. And then you also don't have to worry about either having additional seed costs that are added year after year or having to work your pasture. So that helps reduce some of those costs. But perennial pasture systems also provide a whole bunch of other ecosystem services, which are those benefits that we as a society benefit from our various ecosystems. And those things there are certain things that are just beyond supporting animals for meat and milk production. So in dairy farms, heifers are often touted as the second largest expense behind labor costs. And feeding those dairy heifers is often the largest expense within that category. So when we combine an expensive animal to feed with a cheap feed, with a cheap good feed at that might be a winning combination. So when we consider that combination of dairy heifers and grazing, there are certain topics that come into mind where we try to integrate pasture systems back into dairy production. And some broad questions that come to mind is, can we really develop pasture systems that meet the growing needs for producing adequate replacement heifers? Does implementing these systems impact the farm profitability, and does it make sense economically for a farmer? How can we best manage pastures to meet these or to produce high quality animals, and how much area is needed for these animals? So those are just a few questions, but there's certainly a whole bunch others, and we could spend a whole series of lectures talking about some of these problems. But here I wanted to showcase some of the ongoing research that we are doing to help this cause. So first, I wanted to share some data from a research study that was conducted 10, 12 years ago by Jeff Brink at our research center and our dairy farm at Prairie du Sac, where the objective here was to compare the performance at first lactation from dairy heifers that were raised either on pasture or in confinement. In this study, they enrolled 36 six-month-old heifers, and they followed them from calving all the way through the first lactation. And they had half that were raised on pasture and half in confinement. So they're all the way through the end of the first lactation. The main difference was that half were either had 2 full seasons of grazing during the summers, and they all came back to confinement during the winters when we didn't have pastures available down, or which is normal here in Wisconsin. So for the first year for those heifers, we saw differences in the main difference that we saw there was average daily gain, where the heifers in confinement gained slightly greater than those in confinement, but those heifers on pasture still gained at what we would consider the industry ideal of 1.8 pounds per day. For the second year, there was no real or for that winter season in that second year, there were no real differences between the both, with average daily gain and the final season body weights. They leveled out and they were both equal across both seasons. So after two grazing seasons, the body weights and the average daily gain did not differ between both treatments. But now, when we enter lactation, is when things became interesting. What we saw throughout the whole lactation is that pasture-raised heifers were producing more milk relative to those that were raised in confinement. When we looked at the dry matter intake, those heifers that were raised on pasture were also consuming more feed. So there was something that was being affected or allowing those heifers that were raised on pasture to consume more feed and produce more milk. So at the end of that lactation, those heifers that were raised on pasture produce 2,700 pounds more milk relative to those in confinement, and they also produce a greater total protein in that milk. So what was concluded from that study is that pasture-raised heifers produce more milk, and they had greater capacity for dry matter intake than heifers that were raised on pasture. Unfortunately, for that study, we had a bunch of questions when going over this data because, okay, this is what we observed, but why did it happen? So we're working towards replicating the study to get to the bottom of that question of why do pasture-raised heifers produce more milk at first lactation, and are these results replicable? So we employed a similar experiment, except we added quite a few more heifers this time, and we began this experiment back in May of 2023. And we had 4 groups of 8 heifers that we raised out on pasture and 4 that were raised in confinement. And again, the scheme is similar, where the main difference is that we had 2 full grazing seasons for those heifers that were raised on pasture. And where we are now is we are in this transition phase where this Wednesday, we will be bringing in pretty much the last of the heifers that are set to start calving. So we're quite far along this experiment. And some of the results that we can start sharing with this is that first, for the first grazing season, which was last year, we saw a similar average daily gain in weights for both treatments. So that was good. We wanted to make sure that average daily gain and the body weights were similar, so that we didn't introduce any confounding effects there. We also, every month, this is a busy table, but this is just to say that every month we took structural measurements from those heifers, and we saw no differences in these body measures. So after that first year, we can conclude that structurally, these heifers were similar. We didn't see any differences in hip heights, wither heights, hip widths, or anything of that sort. What was interesting at the end of last year, when we were around this time last year, when we were bringing them inside, is that on the left, we saw a 720-pound heifer that was raised on pasture. And on the right, we had a heifer that weighed pretty much the same, but visually they look quite different. So what we did is we measured back fat to try to quantify the amount of body fat that these heifers had. And as expected, the heifers in confinement had a greater fat layer relative to those that were raised on pasture. This study is still ongoing, and we hope to be able to share results in the coming months. We took similar measurements here, and part of our hypothesis relative to the previous slide, and one of our working hypotheses, is that we essentially have an athlete versus a couch potato of sorts. So we hope to be able to share some exciting results here for the coming years. And I must also add that one thing that we're also employing here is an economic analysis. So we hope to provide a thorough analysis of the economics behind these systems to be able to provide evidence to see whether or not this makes sense economically. Other trials that have fit into the realm we have partnered with other University of UW or UW colleagues down at the Lancaster Ag Research Station, where we've comparing some grazing management trials, comparing either daily, once a week, or twice a week moves in rotationally stock grazing trials. And the objective there is to compare the frequency of moving animals and see how that might affect either animal responses, pasture, biomass production, and nutrient value, and so on. So this is a figure that was developed by my colleague, Marta Coleman, just as a visual, where at the top here we have what we denounce the daily moves, where we have small paddocks and we allocate the animals to a new paddock on a daily basis. And each treatment has a 32-day rest period. In the middle here, we have a 4-day rotation where the paddocks are slightly larger. And at the bottom, we have an 8 days where they're just allocated to a new paddock on a weekly basis. And this is an interesting overview where the Google Earth satellite updated earlier this year. So this is what the site actually looks like. In case I just thought it was interesting to include this here. So we conducted this trial again for 2 years. We just wrapped up the final measurements last week. We don't quite yet have any results for that first year. But as you know, 2023 was dry and 2024 was wet. Some of the results for the first year, we didn't see any obvious treatment effects on animal performance or forage production or nutritive value. We do have to say that the pasture nutritive value was actually below what we would have expected. And all that is a direct results from just not enough water to keep pastures growing. But we're still finalizing these results. And also just working to provide comparisons for these, the way we manage these pastures. This is not a one-person show. This is certainly a collaborative effort with my colleagues from UW, with Dr. Coleman, Dr. Renz, Aaron Crooks from the Lancaster Ag Research Station, Jason Cavadini, and Bill Huffman. And we also have a student, Arthur, that is taking charge of this project. So as a whole, I see my role here to address several challenges in relation to grazing and how we can fit grazing back into the dairy industry or dairy production. And some of the big picture questions that we must work to answer is how much land is needed to produce the required amount of animals and keep those animals that are being raised here in the state and avoiding those transportation costs where folks ship their animals out of state. How do we fit pasture systems into existing crop rotations, and how can we build those integrated crop livestock systems that were common among farms throughout the country? But how do we reduce the potential variability in heifers' growth rates on pasture? And all that is due to a variable forage supply. So how do we best work on best management practices for these systems that help in ensuring that we're producing adequate animals? And then lastly, what are how can we better address the challenges that are needed for additional infrastructure that are required for grazing? Because we see a lot of crop fields that no longer have perimeter fencing. So putting perimeter fencing back into those fields will be a challenge, especially as almost as a paradigm shift for in some instances. So my take-home message is that pasture systems can become integral components of modern dairy, and they fit especially well for developing heifers. And evidence does exist that pasture-raised heifers can provide more milk at first lactation and become an economically feasible or even better economically for the farmer. But questions still remain to understand those mechanisms and the ways in that we can integrate those systems into existing dairy farms. So with that, I will transfer the floor back to Matt.
Thank you, David. I see we've acquired quite a few more participants since we started, but if you do have questions, I don't see any in the chat right now. I would, we called it Q&A before, but on my screen it shows up as chat. That would be a place to add questions. I think our plan right now, since there's none yet, is to move on to our next speaker. But David, I have written down some questions for you, so you won't be off the hook.
All good.
All right, so Stephanie Bowers is our next presenter. And Stephanie is the regional dairy educator with UW Extension for Oconto, Shawano, Winnebago, and Outagamie counties. Boy, those are some Wisconsin-sounding names for counties, if there ever was any. A role she has held since last year. Stephanie was born and raised on a dairy farm in upstate New York. She earned her master's in ruminant nutrition at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and worked with a leading dairy consultancy prior to joining us in Extension. She resides on a dairy farm in Wrightstown with her husband, Jeff, and you can tell that this bio was contributed by the presenter because she is editorialized. She says she has two amazing boys, Jake and Austin. For fun and family adventure, they operate Goats on the Go, Green Bay, a targeted grazing operation using goats and sheep to manage invasive species and nuisance vegetation. They're also actively involved with Wrightstown 4-H, encouraging local youth to get hands-on by sharing their goats and sheep at 4-H projects. So with that intro, Stephanie, I'm sure your children are amazing. Probably not every minute of every day, but Stephanie, go on with your presentation about virtual fencing.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm slightly biased towards my kids, but who wouldn't be? So thanks for the opportunity to be here today and to talk a little bit about virtual fencing. Thanks for your presentation, David. It's great to see grazing as a potential opportunity for dairy heifers as we work through that paradigm shift. And one thing I wanted to mention was perhaps one of the things that is a factor in grazing is childhood memories of the cows are out. That definitely will imprint upon a person. So today we're going to talk about virtual fencing, which is a relatively new technology here in the United States. So we're going to go through what virtual fencing is, how it works, and some potential applications related to dairy heifer grazing. So I've been doing a lot of work in the virtual fencing space through my work here at Extension and also in collaboration with some partners at Greenland's Blue Waters. So virtual fencing is a relatively new technology that can contain ruminant livestock with boundaries created on a farmer's phone. Definitely sounds futuristic, but that time is here. So with virtual fencing, it can reduce the need for physical fences, especially the interior fences when we're looking at grazing paddocks. Virtual fencing can also help reduce the maintenance needed for physical fences and the building labor required for physical fences. It's important to note that with virtual fencing, it's not intended to replace all of your physical fences. You might still need perimeter fences, especially in sensitive areas like next to highways. So right now in the US, there are 4 companies that are just starting to provide virtual fence at different phases. And some of these companies have collars that work with cattle, some work with small ruminants. So it's interesting to see how virtual fence is coming to the US. And right now we're just starting to see our first handful of herds here in Wisconsin. There's 1 or 2 with dairy heifers and a few with beef cattle, and then a larger number with our small ruminants. And to give you an idea of what virtual fencing physically looks like on an animal is you can see here, there are different types of collars that the animals wear. And it's kind of hard to see But there's also some solar panels that are on the collars, so they can be charged with a rechargeable battery and or solar panels on the sides of the monitor that help keep things electric. So the way virtual fencing works is there is the physical collar on the animal, and that collar has the chains on it, which can transmit a gentle shock, if you will, if the animals approach their border. And the way the borders are set is you can create and adjust virtual fence boundaries with a digital map interface like Google Maps, and it's communicated to GPS collars worn by the livestock. So farmers can have these apps on their phone so they can just set a perimeter fence with the touch of a finger to organize a fence. All right, and so the way these collars work is depending upon the brand, there's some variations among brands and how they communicate. But usually the collar is GPS located and has GPS positioning. So the collar talks to satellites, which then talk to the user's phone or tablet app. And with some companies, there's also a base station to help amplify the the signal, if you will, because as we know in Wisconsin, there can be some challenging terrain and cellular networks might not be everywhere. So the way the virtual fence actually works in containing animals is through audio cues. So what happens is you set that fence on your phone, and then as the animal approaches the boundary, it starts to hear an audible cue, and these audible cues get louder as they approach their boundary. And if they keep going, they will eventually get a mild electric shock to tell them that they have reached the edge of their border and they need to turn back. So most animals learn this really quickly, and you will hear those beeps and those sounds as the animals are testing their boundaries, and then they'll turn so that they do not get that shock because they obviously do not want that. So in short, the virtual fencing, it's kind of like dog fencing, but different in that the per unit cost is cheaper per unit, but you're going to need a lot of units. Right now for cattle, there's a lot of variance in cost, but around $300 per collar per cow, and those collars can last 5 to 10 years, plus an annual subscription fee. The batteries within these collars can hold a longer charge. Some hold them all season, some hold them for a month, some are solar. The solar batteries, they aren't even changeable. They just are able to maintain that battery power. And the virtual fences, they're built for livestock. So they have to be hardy because animals are not exactly the gentlest of creatures. And the other really important thing is that there's no underground wire. It's all set through the collar communicating with the satellites, communicating with your phone. And then that electric pulse is delivered through chains that are on the side of the animal's neck. So I kind of look at the collars like a combination between a dog collar, a shot collar, a little cell phone for each animal, just those different technologies combined. So the effectiveness of virtual fence. What we have learned is that virtual fence, once animals are trained, they work very, very well so long as you have good cell service and there's no geomagnetic storms like we had last week. And the audio cues are automated, predictable, and avoidable. So we have actually seen animals that know exactly how many seconds they have before they get that shock. So they will keep going to grab that last bite of delicious feed before they turn and go back in the direction they should be going. What's also been fascinating is what happens if an animal escapes. So sometimes you might have an animal that does, escape the virtual pasture and now she's not where she's supposed to be. If it's just one, they will return to the herd because they want to be with their buddies. And what's really fascinating with the virtual fence is it's a one-way fence. So your animal escapes, but it does not get shocked upon re-entry. So that encourages the animals to stay together as a herd, which is critical. And there's also been a significant amount of research that has been done on virtual fence because animal welfare is definitely a concern. One frequently asked question is, well, if an animal escapes, will it keep getting shocked? And the answer is no. Depending upon the brand, usually they go through like 2 rounds of escapes and then it stops shocking them out of welfare considerations. And let's say the animals got spooked or whatever caused them to leave, even if there was a physical fence, they'd tear through it and just keep going. So we want to be able to treat our animals humanely, and that's just how that works. So the benefits to the farmer with virtual fencing is you can create fences really quickly on your phone. There is like there can be up to a 15-minute delay between the time you create the map on your phone and the time it uploads to the collar, because it has to go from your phone to the satellites to the collar. But you can set fences ahead of time. Some of the brands have it so you can even like automatically schedule paddock moves. So I find this really fascinating when we talk about dairy heifers, because you can schedule dairy heifer moves up to, any number of times a day. So you can calculate out when they're going to run out of feed, and then, it can automatically allow them into the next pasture so that they can get fresh feed. With virtual fencing, it can decrease labor requirements because you're not setting up and taking down as much interior fencing if you have that kind of setup. And you can manage and move your livestock from your mobile device. And the animals, they are constantly testing their boundaries because they're animals. And so once you move that boundary, they learn usually within a couple hours, if not sooner, that, the fence has moved, now they can go farther. So that works out really, really nicely. Another huge opportunity with virtual fencing and this kind of technology is you can track livestock in real time. So let's say it's midnight and you just heard a terrible storm go through. You can just pick up your phone and look on your phone and see exactly where your animals are. It's a huge peace of mind to be able to know, okay, the animals didn't get out, they're right where they need to be. It's fantastic. Or if you have an animal that, let's say, you miss bringing a Springer into the barn and she has a calf out on pasture and she's separate from the herd. Well, if you want to figure out where she is, you can just look on your phone and it's got a GPS location of where that heifer is. So that can also save a lot of time. The other interesting benefit is if an animal does escape or you do have a lot of notifications, you're notified right away. So if something happens, your animals spook, you get an instant notification of where your animals escaped and where they are. So even though they are out, you can now go find them without spending hours looking for them. And then as we look at the evolution of technology with these collars, some of the brands are also incorporating other technologies. So it's not just defense, but we're also looking at animal heat cycles. We're looking at animal health. We're looking at rumination. So just figuring out the integration of technologies to come up with an opportunity. And just that peace of mind of being able to monitor your animals anytime, anywhere. You go to a wedding on a Saturday night and you want to make sure your heifers are still in, they're in. Just fantastic. So some of the benefits that can be to the land when you're using virtual fence is you can actually fence in some pretty hard to reach areas. With our dairy heifers, we're not typically grazing them in as rough a conditions as some of our small ruminants, but you could like graze heifers in a place that isn't easily fenceable, like a ravine or a marshy area, or you can just you have the ability to set up fences in areas that you don't really want to put a physical fence. Another opportunity with virtual fencing is you don't have wildlife getting caught in your interior fences. And then going back to the multiple moves per day, the benefits to soil health and regenerative ag. So that's been fascinating. We've also seen some farmers who are able to graze cover crops using virtual fencing. So you don't have all the break wires through the middle of your field. You just have a good perimeter fence and then your virtual collars on the interior. So it enables you to more fully utilize your land in a variety of ways. And then every year technology is getting better. So we're looking at some collars that can integrate with some vegetation density monitors so that we can maximize forage utilization and just really, really work our land to the best of its ability. In the future, we might also be able to measure soil moisture and calculate out more soil carbon metrics. And then our animal health metrics, going back to temperature of the animal, heat cycles, calving, just those different things that we can look at that can really help us manage our animals better. And with virtual fencing, it is something to think about and consider for the future if you are working with NRCS. NRCS is currently working on adopting virtual fencing as a mode of fencing for animals. So if you are interested in virtual fencing, it is possible that it could be covered or partially cost shared through NRCS, but you need to check with your local representative to figure out the status of that and what's going on there. And with that, I would be delighted to answer any questions. I could talk virtual fencing all day.
Thank you, Stephanie. I don't see any questions yet. And we got, oh, just wait. Did we have somebody that wanted to verbally ask a question and rather than use the chat?
Matt, there's a question in the Q&A. Says, are you looking at parasite control for pasture, including liver flukes? I think that's a David question for David.
So we haven't specifically looked at any parasite controls per se. What we've done here is basically just followed the veterinary guidance on that, and we haven't really veered much off that.
So I think that would be liver flukes. I think is that vector is that deer often? Do you have a lot of deer by the station there? I think it would be local if you need liver fluke control or not. Does that sound correct, David?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't want to no, I would not be the right person to ask about that. And I don't want to say anything out of.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for fielding that question. I had a box on my screen covering the Q&A, so I'll try better. David, you mentioned trials at Lancaster, Prairie du Sac, multiple years at Marshfield. Were any of those heifers supplemented while they were on pasture?
No, so the heifers that for the what we call the pasture versus confinement trial that was done 12 years ago, that first season they were supplemented with protein feed at 0.5% of their body weight, and that was just a daily allotment of concentrate there on pasture every day. And we did the same last year, basically to give ourselves an insurance policy that the body weights were the same. But the other grazing trial that we were doing at Lancaster, it was no supplement, and those were dairy beef heifers. And we are also doing other grazing work that I didn't present here, but we're also not supplementing those heifers because we wanted to see how much we would get just on grass.
And then you mentioned, like on the 2-year trials, that was one year actually the pasture heifers exceeded, or they were, maybe it was the performance on pastures varied by season?
Oh yeah, that was in Lancaster. Last year was extremely dry, so the performance was just lower than what we would expect, and what
At,
we
at
would
your,
have wanted.
okay, at your Marshfield location, when they go on pasture, then in the winter they're treated the same as the confinement heifers, and then they go back in pasture.
Right.
Is there any compensatory gain over the winter feeding period where even given the same diet that the pasture heifers would gain faster?
Yeah, so that's something with our replicated trial that we're doing with our new version of the pasture. So actually, let me back that up. So yes, there is some compensatory gain that it is observed. Those heifers that come a little thin at the end of the season, you feed them the same diet, and you'll see that they start gaining quite a bit faster than those that had been in the barn all along.
Then I was curious. Oh, we got a Q&A again. Maybe I should stop robbing the space.
Well, Matt, too, give me, we have somebody who has his hand raised, so I'm going to allow him to speak. Alan, you should be able to speak if you want to ask a question. And then Matt, you can go to that Q&A.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jackie. I'm here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm actually a regenerative agricultural consultant specialized in rotational grazing. And I've had quite a few years experience in New Zealand and also here in the States. And just getting some experience with the halter system from New Zealand. And the beauty of the halter system, it not only guides the cows around the paddock, but also monitors for heat detection and also monitors the rumination for general animal health. And it's super fantastic. Yeah.
What's the cost in those?
Yeah, a halter right at the moment coming into the States, depending on your location and whatnot. But basically, there's two packages. Well, actually three, but the two main ones for either beef or dairy. For the dairy, it ranges anywhere from about 75 up to about $120 per year for and per cow. So that's roughly $8 to $10 a month. That's and you lease those collars for a minimum 2-year contract, and then you have a base station located somewhere on your farm. Also for beef, it's around $60 for a year, so it's about $5 a month, but for the same service and whatnot.
So, Alan, there's a chat for you. Stephanie wants to, and I know she's been in contact with the halter people because,
Yep.
but she provided you her email there so that she could talk a little more about the halter system.
Okay.
And then I can go to the Q&A. How would climate change impact pasture practice dynamics? Is the effect of heat stress different between pasture versus confinement? And let's direct this to David.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So with the impending climate change, we're expecting drier and warmer conditions in pretty much everywhere. But in our regions, we'll probably expect much warmer than we're used to summer, so that might impact some of our pasture productivity. And as we know, not every pasture here provides shade. We are working on an experiment next year where we're wanting to answer that question if dairy heifers really do experience heat stress in these parts, or if they don't. So my question or my feeling is that there is a bit of heat stress that is experienced at certain parts of the summer here. in these regions, but it's not as constant as you would or as an animal would experience further south, where it's just constantly hot and humid.
All right, we still got some more time. I was curious, you mentioned it was toward the end of the season with your trial this year that you were moving heifers off of pasture to confinement to adjust to being a milking cow. So how far ahead of a due date or whatever are you moving these animals off?
Yeah, so we're moving those heifers in about 6 weeks before their predicted calving date, and we're putting them on kaolin doors where we can manage their intake. So the kaolin gates just allow us to feed or better track their intake. So we want to be able to track their intake before and right after calving, so we can keep track of other metrics in their as they transition onto being full cows.
And I was curious about the slide with the difference in back fat between the two groups. Was that, what was the unit? Was that centimeters of back fat or what was that?
That was millimeters.
Millimeters.
Yep. And we did the same measurements earlier or at the end of this grazing season. So I just didn't have I don't think we've processed the data quite yet. I haven't seen our student Carlos yet. He's quite busy with that. So I do see a question that what kind of forages were the heifers grazing on? So we have them grazing here at the the Marshall Ag Research Station, and those pastures are just a giant mix of orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, tall fescue, and clover. So it's just very typical pastures for this area.
Stephanie and I were out to the station in August, I suppose that was, maybe it was September, and saw the pastures. Some of them have been established quite a while, so it's quite a mixture in there.
Yep.
So back that back fat, neither of those groups were excessively heavy then, really, though.
No, they weren't. They were just fed the typical herd diet from that is done here at the farm.
And then you were talking about first lactation performance as a standard to compare the two groups. Will you, or do you have any information, I don't know, I just read an article about how greatly culling has been reduced in the dairy industry, that we have a heifer shortage. You call them athletes versus couch potatoes. You would think that possibly there might be some lifetime productive life issues there. Do you have or intend to have any information on how the groups compare on that?
Yeah, so that's always the number one question that we get. So what happens beyond the first lactation? And the truth is, it's just so difficult for us to keep animals tied up for so long. But our intention is to keep an eye on these animals and see what happens beyond that. We have to keep in mind that they are a shared resource, and there's other researchers here. So it's hard for us to tie up 60 plus cows for a number of years. Our plans are to keep monitoring these heifers, but we're going to do the best as we can. Maybe that's not the best answer, but sometimes our hands are tied behind our backs.
Oh, you hear things about like even how soon colostrum is presented, that might have a lifetime effect. So I think there'd be great interest in that. And obviously, if they get culled because of a different trial that's still neutral, it would still be what was happening to them when they're a heifer if there's any differences. So I'm sure there'd be a lot of interest.
And to add to what you just said, Matt, my colleague Lizzie French, she is actually following these calves. So she is the plan is to follow them through to the end of first lactation from the calves that are being born now. So it becomes almost a fetal programming type study and seeing what happens to the following generations. It's just monitoring these actual heifers over the long term under these conditions is a bit more challenging logistically.
Okay, thank you, David. I didn't mean to send all my questions to you, so I have a few for Stephanie as well.
No, it's
So
all good.
you mentioned, Stephanie, that you called it geomagnetic storms last week. So on my Facebook, I have all sorts of the most fantastic pictures of Aurora Borealis. So were you implying, I think you got some firsthand experience. Was that difficult on these satellite-based systems? Is that why we talked the perimeter fence so much? That did they fail this last week when the satellite system wasn't working correctly?
So what happened last week with the satellites is it just made any GPS a little wonky. So when you're talking about dairy heifers and larger pastures, increasing your variance on like the edge of the field, like increasing your accuracy, I guess is a better word. You just need a bigger area to create a little more wiggle. Like if you have a perimeter fence and your heifers can go 20 feet farther or even 50 feet farther than what you intended because there's some sort of satellite interference, they're still safe. Whereas if that 20 to 50 feet is on the edge of a highway, then there's a definite safety concern. So perimeter fencing, especially around cropland too, is just a good backup measure, like in case anything happens. It also, yeah, or if animals get spooked. So there's a dairy heifer grazer that I'm working with, and he has virtual collars. His heifers got spooked in a thunderstorm in the middle of the night, and they escaped their virtual boundary, but the physical boundary at the long end of like a 40-acre section stopped them. They had calmed down by that point in time. So they still were contained in the perimeter fence, although not where they had originally wanted them. And that was the only incident he had, was just that thunderstorm. So it made it a little easier to keep them contained because they were within that physical fence boundary. If he didn't have the physical fence for a boundary, they could have continued on and you would have known exactly where they ended up, but it would have been more challenging to get them. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Stephanie.
It's fascinating.
You said the implementation you felt was a little higher with the small ruminants. And to me, smaller, they're typically going to be a lower value animal, but the collar must be about the same cost. So it's interesting that the implementation might be higher there when more expensive collar, smaller animal. Did you have any thought, or maybe they're harder to fence in? Maybe that solved the problem I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, so with small ruminants, it depends upon the purpose and why you have small ruminants. So some people choose to graze small ruminants to manage invasive species on extremely challenging land that they may or may not own. So looking at like the targeted sheep and goat grazers that are out there, the virtual fencing can help because you're constantly on new pasture with those places. You're not like with dairy heifers, you have a 40-acre section and you create your paddocks and you're continually rotationally grazing them. Whereas with small ruminants, sometimes you're using them as a tool for vegetation management and destruction as opposed to rotational grazing. Do you see the difference there, Matt? Like if you're trying to like kill buckthorn or kill other plants, you want to overgraze it so that you can do a pasture renovation. Whereas with dairy heifers, you're sticking with a higher quality pasture. You're not grazing it as short. You're managing it for optimum nutrition and benefit of those heifers. Does that help answer it?
Well, I have another question then.
Absolutely.
All right. So if you're doing that invasive species sort of grazing thing, we'd mentioned multiple times here the value of a perimeter fence. It would seem
Yeah.
if you're going to different sites with invasive species that, and then making the animal graze hard, you said, maybe you're not
Mhm.
optimizing their average daily gain like you would be with a dairy heifer, that they might be
Right.
a little hungrier if they're encouraged to eat the buckthorn. Do you still rely on a perimeter fence in that system, or does it open up to you to use those systems without a perimeter fence?
I perceive that the company recommendation would be to always have a perimeter fence. However, I am familiar with small ruminant grazers who sometimes use perimeter fences and sometimes don't. And then because you are trying to push your animals to get them to eat those non ideal species.
Okay. We're getting close to our hour. That's our promise with you folks. And I got most of my questions answered, and I don't see any others in there. So just a few closing comments. Thank you, David and Stephanie, for very interesting topics. I think we broadened our focus here in the dairy nutrition forage group, talking about these newer practices. I hope those of you in the audience enjoyed today's webinar. And come and join us again in the future. So next month's Badger Dairy Insight is November 19th, again at 11. And our topics will be reducing enteric methane emissions in U.S. Holstein cows. You can see additional information at the Badger Dairy Insight website, which is go.wisc.edu/Badger Dairy. And the slide just came up with our speakers for those topics. I'm just going to say first names, Francisco and Guillermo. So I think we got a pretty good staff lined up for that as well. We also have a few more webinars left in the Dairy Spanish webinar El Break, Info Lechero 2.0. These webinars are in Spanish only and are hosted on Wednesdays from 12 to 1 p.m. So just to remind you again that our information is unbiased, university-based dairy resources, and please visit the Extension Dairy program on the web at dairy.extension.wisc.edu or find us on Facebook at extension-agriculture! Thank you.